Welcome to Cozy English. Tonight we travel. Not urgently, not with heavy bags and long queues and delayed flights. We travel the way good stories travel, slowly, with attention, noticing the light on the water and the smell of bread from a bakery in a street we don't know, and the particular feeling of being somewhere new, where everything is slightly unfamiliar and therefore slightly alive. These stories are about people on the move, people discovering new places and rediscovering old ones, people on trains and boats and coastal paths and mountain roads and city streets they have never walked before. The English in these stories is the English of travel, of directions and distances, of arrivals and departures, of the particular conversations that happen between strangers when the world opens up around them. Find a comfortable position, let your body settle, and travel with us tonight. If this channel helps you learn, please subscribe. New stories every week for learners everywhere. Let's go. Story 1. The Overnight Train. The train left at 10:45 in the evening and arrived, according to the schedule, at 7:19 the following morning. Claudia had never taken an overnight train before. She had booked it partly for practical reasons. It saved a hotel night, and partly because there was something about the idea of sleeping on a moving train that appealed to her in a way she couldn't quite justify. It was romantic in the old-fashioned sense. It was the kind of journey people used to take. Her compartment held 6 berths, 3 on each side, stacked in tiers. When she arrived, 2 of the other berths were already occupied. A young man in the middle berth on the opposite side was reading with a small clip-on light, completely absorbed. An older woman in the top berth on Claudia's side was already asleep, or at least still, facing the wall, a folded jacket over her shoulders as a blanket. Claudia had the lower berth on her side. She sat on the edge of it and looked out the window. The platform was brightly lit. People moved along it with bags and cases. A guard walked past blowing a whistle. Then, with a long, deep sound that was more felt than heard, the train began to move. The platform slid away. The bright lights of the station gave way to the darkness of tracks and then to the darkness of the city at night. Amber street lamps, lit windows, the occasional flash of a crossing. Claudia watched the city pass and felt something loosen in her, a tension she hadn't known she was carrying, releasing gently as the train gathered speed. She made her berth. The railway had provided a small pillow and a thin blanket, both of which she used. She lay down and looked at the ceiling, which was low and close, and listened to the rhythmic sound of the wheels on the track. It was a good sound, steady and purposeful, a sound that said, "You are going somewhere. Rest. We will get you there." She fell asleep before the city had fully given way to countryside and slept through all of it, through the dark fields and the station stops she never saw and the first light of dawn over unfamiliar hills, and woke to the guard's voice through the intercom announcing arrival in 40 minutes, and looked out the window to find the world entirely different from the one she had last seen, and felt, even before the journey was over, that she had arrived somewhere. Story 2. The Island. The ferry to Gala Island ran twice a day in summer and once in winter, and the crossing took 45 minutes in calm weather, and considerably longer, and considerably less comfortably, when the sea was rough. Tom arrived at the ferry terminal on a Tuesday in late April, when the season was just beginning and the island was not yet crowded. He had a backpack, a sleeping bag, and a booking at a small guest house in the only village on the island's eastern shore. He had come because a colleague had mentioned the island once in passing, something about a walk along the western cliffs that was among the finest things she had ever done. and he had remembered this and looked it up and booked it on a Thursday evening on an impulse that he had declined to examine too closely. The ferry was a modest vessel, white and blue, smelling of diesel and salt. He sat on the upper deck, outside, despite the wind, and watched the mainland recede. The sea was gray-green and corrugated, and the ferry moved through it with a steady rolling motion that he found, after the first 10 minutes, pleasant rather than unsettling. The island appeared on the horizon as a low, dark shape, growing slowly as they approached until it resolved itself into cliffs and headlands and the white cluster of houses at the eastern shore. The guest house was run by a woman named Bimhairi, who greeted him with the particular manner of island hospitality, direct, unhurried, entirely genuine. She showed him to his room, which had a small window that faced west, and left him to settle. He spent 4 days on the island. He walked every day, covering the various paths that the single map available at the post office described in sparse but accurate terms. He walked the western cliffs on the second day, as his colleague had suggested, and understood immediately why she had used the word finest. The cliffs dropped 300 feet to a sea that was deep and blue in the afternoon light, and the path ran along their edge with nothing between it and the drop but air, and the wind came off the Atlantic with a force and freshness that made him feel, powerfully and without complication, alive. He saw seabirds he could not name, which he resolved to look up and then didn't, because the not knowing felt appropriate to the place. He walked in the rain on the third day without minding. He sat in the island's single pub on the third evening and talked to a fisherman for 2 hours about the state of the sea and the state of the world, in that order. On the last morning, waiting for the ferry back, he stood on the pier and looked at the island he was leaving. He had been here 4 days. He felt, in some way he would struggle to explain, that he was leaving something behind. The ferry came. He got on. The island grew smaller behind him. He was already thinking about coming back. Story 3. Lost in Lisbon. She had been in Lisbon for 3 hours and was already lost. This was not unusual for Yuki. She had a poor sense of direction and had accepted this about herself many years ago. She had also accepted, after several instances of evidence, that being lost was rarely as catastrophic as it felt, and occasionally led somewhere more interesting than the intended destination. She had a paper map. She preferred them to her phone for unfamiliar cities, because they gave her a sense of the whole place rather than just the line between where she was and where she was going. But she had turned it around twice in the last 10 minutes, and was no longer certain which direction she was facing. The street she was on was narrow and cobbled, climbing steeply in the way that Lisbon streets climbed, dramatically, indifferently to the inconvenience of pedestrians. The houses on either side were tiled in blue and white and faded yellow, their facades intricate with patterns. Window boxes spilled geraniums. The smell of coffee drifted from somewhere nearby. She stopped and looked at the map. A man leaning in a doorway a few meters ahead watched her with mild interest. "You're lost," he said, in English, not a question. "Very much so," she said. He held out his hand for the map. She gave it to him. He looked at it, turned it once, turned it back, and pointed at a spot. "We're here," he said. "Where do you want to be?" She showed him the place on the map, a viewpoint she had read about, which was supposed to have a view of the whole city and the river below. He nodded and gave her directions. They were detailed and specific. Left at the fountain, straight up the hill until the blue church, then right at the yellow house with the green shutters, and you'll see the entrance on your left. He went over them twice without being asked. "Thank you," she said. "Your English is very good." "I lived in London for 7 years," he said. "Then I came home." He said this without apparent regret, but in the way of someone who had considered the decision carefully. She followed his directions. The fountain was where he said. The blue church was where he said. The yellow house with green shutters was exactly as described. She reached the viewpoint and walked to the railing and looked out. The city spread below her in terracotta and white, climbing its hills in every direction, and beyond it the river opened wide and silver, and beyond the river the sky. She stood there for a long time, the map folded in her pocket, not needing it now. She had been lost. She was here. These two things were connected. Story 4. The Road Trip. They had been planning the road trip for 4 years. This was not because it was particularly complicated. It was because Leo and his brother Sam had talked about it every time they saw each other. At family events, at the occasional weekend visit, and talked about it well enough that the talking had been satisfying in itself, without the trip needing to materialize. Then their father had died, in February, and at the funeral Sam had said, quietly, in the car park outside the church, "We should do the road trip this summer." And Leo had said, yes. And this time, they did. It was a 10-day drive along the coast, north to south, then a loop inland through the hills, then back to where they had started. They drove Leo's car, which was old enough to have a certain character and new enough to be reliable. They had no fixed accommodation bookings, which had seemed reckless in the planning and turned out to be freeing in practice. On the 3rd day, they took a wrong turning and ended up on a road that was not on their map. A narrow road that climbed through pine forest and came out, unexpectedly, at the edge of a lake that neither of them knew existed. They stopped the car. The lake was completely still and completely alone. There were no other cars, no buildings, no sign that anyone had been there recently. They sat on a rock at the water's edge for an hour without making any decision to do so. Sam threw stones. Leo looked at the reflections of the pines in the water, which were so precise that the reflection looked more real than the trees. "Dad would have liked this," Sam said. "He would have complained about the drive," Leo said. "Then he would have liked it." Sam laughed. "True." They talked about their father, there at the edge of the unknown lake. Not the large things, not the loss, not the grief, which was real but not what the moment called for. The small things, the particular ways he had been himself, his opinions about the correct method of making tea, the films he had watched repeatedly and quoted extensively, his driving, which had been ambitious. By the time they got back in the car, the light had shifted to late afternoon gold. They drove south. They talked and did not talk, in the comfortable rhythm of brothers. They stopped at a small town for dinner and ate at a table outside, watching the evening settle over the rooftops. They found a place to stay, a guest house above a bakery, with rooms that smelled faintly of bread. Leo lay awake for a while that night. He could hear Sam in the next room, already asleep, the particular quality of stillness that came through the wall from a sleeping person. He thought about the lake, he thought about his father, he thought about all the years of talking about the trip, and how the talking had been one thing and the trip was another thing entirely, and both had been necessary. He was glad they had come. Story 5. A Week in the Mountains. The mountain hut had 12 bunks, 2 gas burners, 1 table, and a view that made all of this entirely worthwhile. Petra had walked 4 hours to reach it. She had set out from the valley floor in the early morning, when the air was still cold and the path through the lower forest was dim and damp, and climbed steadily through tree cover that gradually thinned as she gained altitude until she emerged, at 2,000 meters, into open rock and sky. The hut sat on a shelf of flat ground above a kwum, a natural bowl in the mountain carved by an ancient glacier, and from its single window the view looked straight down into the valley she had come from, now tiny and distant, and across to the opposing range, which stood white-peaked against a deep blue sky. She was alone. She had planned it this way, not because she was antisocial, she wasn't, particularly, but because she had wanted 1 week entirely unmediated. No one else's needs to consider, no plans to negotiate, just the mountain and her own pace. She cooked pasta on the gas burner and ate it sitting in the doorway, looking at the valley below as the light faded. The air at this height was clean in a way that felt almost physical. You were aware of breathing it in, aware of its quality. She spent 4 days walking from the hut. Each morning she chose a direction and went. She was careful with this. She had maps and a compass, and she checked the weather each morning on the small radio the hut provided, and she left a note of her intended route before she set out. She had learned, from experience, that freedom in the mountains required preparation. On the 3rd day she reached a ridge that she had seen from below and walked along it with the valley on one side and a deeper valley on the other, and the sky enormous in every direction. She stopped at the highest point of the ridge and stood still. There was no sound except wind and, very distantly, a bird she could not see. No people, no roads. She could turn in any direction and see nothing made by human hands except, far below in the eastern valley, the thin gray line of a track. She stood there for a long time. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was simply present, in the body, in the moment, in the mountain. When she walked back to the hut that evening, she felt scrubbed clean of something. She did not have a name for what had been scrubbed away. She was not sure she needed one. She made tea and sat in the doorway and watched the stars appear, one by one, in the darkening sky above the kwum. At altitude, there was no light pollution. The stars were dense and extraordinary, the Milky Way visible as a pale band from one horizon to the other. She went to bed when it was fully dark and slept the sound, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has used her body correctly. Story 6. The Slow Boat. The river cruise was not the kind of holiday Marcus would have chosen for himself. It had been his mother's idea, and he had agreed to come because she had asked carefully, and he could see that it mattered to her, and because he was 45 and old enough to know that there were not unlimited opportunities to take a 10-day holiday with your 72-year-old mother. He had expected to be bored. He had expected the pace to be too slow, the other passengers too elderly, the scenery too uniformly pastoral. He had packed 3 books as insurance. He read one of them. The other 2 stayed in his bag. The boat was small, 22 passengers, a crew of 8, and moved at a pace that he had initially found maddening and came to find, within 48 hours, deeply restful. The river moved past. The landscape moved past. You stood on the deck with a cup of coffee and watched it go, and it went, and there was nothing to do about it, and nothing required of you. His mother was in her element. She talked to everyone. Marcus had long since accepted, a gift for immediate and genuine connection with strangers that he had not inherited. Within the first evening, she knew the names and approximate life histories of most of the other passengers. She came to dinner on the second night with news of a couple from New Zealand who had been traveling for 6 months and a retired surgeon from Portugal who was writing a book about rivers, and a woman traveling alone who had recently left a long marriage and was, his mother reported, extremely brave. "How do you know she's brave?" Marcus said. "Because she told me she's terrified," his mother said, "and she's doing it anyway. That's what brave is." They stopped at towns along the river. They walked medieval streets and looked at churches and ate local food at restaurants his mother found through a combination of instinct and the advice of crew members. She was a good traveler, curious, uncomplaining, happy to walk further than planned if something interesting presented itself. On the 7th day, they sat on the deck in the late afternoon as the boat moved through a wide section of river where the banks were low and the landscape opened out in every direction. The light was horizontal and golden, touching everything it reached. His mother was looking at the water. Marcus looked at her, at the profile he knew better than almost any face in the world, in this late golden light. "Thank you for coming," she said, without turning. "Thank you for asking," he said. She patted his hand once, briefly. They watched the river. He had not been bored. He had, in fact, not thought about his ordinary life in London with anything like the frequency he had expected. The boat had a way of suspending ordinary time and replacing it with something slower and more immediate. He was not sure yet what he would make of that when he was back in London. He thought he might make quite a lot of it. Story 7. The Wrong Train. Nina got on the wrong train. She had checked the platform number twice and the departure board once, and had then been distracted by a phone call from her sister and had walked, with the automatic confidence of someone who believes they know where they are going, onto a train that was going somewhere entirely different from where she needed to be. She realized this when the train began to move, and she looked at the route map on the wall of the carriage and saw that the list of stops did not contain her destination. She sat very still for a moment, processing this. Then she took a breath and looked at the next stop on the route map. 22 minutes away. From there would almost certainly be a connection. She took out her phone and checked. Yes, a train from the next stop to her destination, leaving 12 minutes after this one arrived. She would be 40 minutes late. She texted the person she was meeting. "Took wrong train. Will be 40 mins late. So sorry." She received back almost immediately a string of laughing emojis and, "Happens to the best of us. See you when you get here." She put her phone away and looked out the window. Well, she was on the wrong train to somewhere she had never been, with 22 minutes to fill. She looked around the carriage. An older man was doing a crossword. A teenager was asleep with headphones on. A woman across the aisle was feeding a baby, entirely peacefully, looking out the window. Near the door, a group of 4 students were talking in low voices about something that seemed to involve a great deal of barely suppressed amusement. She looked at the passing landscape. She didn't know this part of the country. The train ran through flat farmland, then a small town with a church tower, then a stretch of woodland where the trees came right up to the edge of the track. She had not planned to be here. She was here. The light was doing something interesting to the top of the woodland, catching the leaves from below and making them bright against a heavy gray sky. She watched this and felt, instead of the anxiety she might have expected, a mild and entirely irrational pleasure. She changed trains at the next stop and arrived 43 minutes late, not 40. She apologized again at the door. "What was the wrong train like?" asked her friend Amara, who knew her well. "Unexpectedly interesting," Nina said. Of course it was, Amara said. Come in, there's food. Story 8. The Walking Holiday. The guidebook described the coastal path as moderately challenging, which Jonah had interpreted as easy, and which turned out to mean something considerably more demanding than easy, particularly on the third day, when the path climbed 400 meters over headland in the space of about 2 kilometers. He stopped at the top to catch his breath and look at the view, which was the kind of view that made the climb worth it instantly and without argument. The sea spread south and west in an unbroken expanse of blue-gray, and the path dropped away below him to the bay, where the water was impossibly clear and turquoise over white sand. He had been walking for 6 days, 7 more to go. He had a pack that had been carefully assembled and weighed and reassembled twice before departure, and which after 6 days felt both lighter, because he had eaten much of the food, and heavier, because his shoulders had opinions about it that had grown more articulate each day. He had done this kind of walking holiday twice before, different coastlines, similar conditions. He came back to it for reasons he had different answers to depending on when you asked. The simplest answer, it clarified things. Daily life accumulated around you slowly, like sediment, obligations and habits and small dissatisfactions that you didn't notice building up until you stepped away from them for 2 weeks and walked along a cliff path in the sea wind and found that a great deal of what you had been preoccupied with was not actually important. At the evening stopping point, a small town with a pub and a campsite behind it, he met 3 other walkers doing the same route. They ate at the same table without particularly planning to. There was a woman named Bridget who was a nurse from Dublin on her annual long walk, a semi-retired geography teacher named Howard who took extensive notes in a small notebook at intervals, and a young woman named Suki who was, she said, walking because she had recently finished a relationship and needed something to do with her body and her thoughts. Walking is good for that, Bridget said. Is it helping? Jonah asked Suki. She considered this. During the walking, yes, she said. The evenings are harder. The evenings are always harder, Howard said, with the authority of someone who had concluded this over many walking holidays. They agreed, without formal discussion, to walk the next day's stage together. This happened sometimes on long walks, people whose paths ran parallel for a while, walking alongside each other in a companionable way that didn't require anything to continue beyond the shared miles. Sometimes they kept in touch, sometimes they didn't. The meeting was complete in itself. They walked the next day's stage together. Howard made notes. Bridget told stories about her patients that were both funny and respectful of their dignity. Suki was quieter than the evening before, but not unhappily so. Jonah walked at the back for a stretch and watched the 3 of them ahead of him on the path, and thought about the particular nature of this kind of temporary companionship, people who appeared at the edge of your life for a day, and then continued in their own direction. At the end of the next day's stage, they went their different ways. Jonah walked on for 6 more days and finished the path at the southern headland on a clear afternoon and stood at the end of the land looking out at the sea. He felt, as he always felt at this point, a mixture of completion and reluctance. He had arrived. The walk was done. He stood there for a long time before he turned around. Story 9. The city I didn't expect to love. Caroline had not wanted to go to Oporto. The trip had been her partner's idea, a long weekend to celebrate an anniversary, and she had agreed without particular enthusiasm. She had been to Portugal before, to Lisbon, and had liked it, and felt vaguely that she had done Portugal, and there were other places she would rather go. She had said none of this because it was ungracious, and gone with an open but not especially expectant mind. By the end of the first afternoon, she was in love with the city. She could not have predicted this, and could not entirely explain it. Cities did not always announce themselves. Sometimes you arrived somewhere famous and felt nothing, and sometimes you arrived somewhere you had not thought much about and felt an immediate, irrational recognition. Oporto was the second kind. It was the hills, partly. The city climbed steeply from the river in all directions, its streets and staircases and tiled facades rising in layers that you discovered by walking without a fixed route, by turning left instead of right, by following a staircase that appeared between two buildings, by going up when you could go down. It was a city that rewarded the wrong turning and punished the overly planned itinerary. It was the light, which was the particular golden amber light of cities close to the Atlantic, a light that seemed to come from the stone itself as much as from the sky. It was the river, the Douro, wide and slow and crossed by bridges that were each different in character. She and her partner walked across all of them over the 4 days. It was a bookshop she found on the second day, 4 stories of books in a building with carved wooden shelves and a ceiling that made you look up as soon as you entered. She spent 2 hours there and bought 3 books she could have found anywhere and did not need and was glad to have. It was a meal on the 3rd evening at a restaurant recommended by no one. They had simply looked in the window and decided to try, where they ate things they could not always name, drank the local wine, and stayed long past the point when other tables had left. At the airport on the last morning, waiting at the gate, Caroline felt a particular low-level grief of a good trip ending. "You liked it," her partner said. "I didn't expect to," she said. "I know," he said, with the small satisfaction of someone who had chosen well. "We're coming back," she said. "I know that too," he said. Story 10. The Language. When Patrick arrived in Japan, he spoke no Japanese. This was not ideal. He had known it was not ideal before he left, and had downloaded a translation app and a phrase book, and had learned, on the 14-hour flight over, how to say hello, thank you, excuse me, where is the station, and 1 beer please. He felt this was the minimum necessary for human function. He was, more or less, correct. Tokyo received him with the organized efficiency of a city that had been accommodating visitors for a long time and had worked out how to do it graciously. Signs at the airport were in Japanese and English. The train to the city was complicated, but had English announcements and color-coded maps. He arrived at his hotel without incident. The language, however, was another matter. He was a reader. Books, menus, signs, packaging, and in Tokyo he could read almost nothing. This was a more profound disorientation than he had anticipated. He was accustomed to moving through the world with the security of language, and without it he felt, not frightened exactly, but smaller, reduced to a simpler version of himself. He discovered, over the following days, that this was not entirely bad. Without language, he was more dependent on other things: observation, gesture, the universal grammar of pointing and smiling and holding up fingers to indicate numbers. He paid closer attention to faces, to tone of voice, to the way people moved and positioned themselves. He became, out of necessity, a better watcher. He also discovered that the Japanese people he encountered were consistently patient with his attempts to communicate, and that his attempts, however clumsy, were met with something that felt like genuine kindness rather than tolerance. In a small ramen shop on the fourth day, he managed to order by pointing at the menu and holding up one finger. The woman behind the counter, perhaps 60, with a precise and busy manner, brought his bowl, watched him pick up the chopsticks with something less than confidence, and then, without making anything of it, brought him a fork. She set it beside his bowl and went back to her work. He used the fork. He was not embarrassed. He was grateful for the casual, thoughtful practicality of the gesture. He ate the ramen, which was extraordinary, and sat in the small shop and listened to the sounds around him. The sounds of a language he could not understand, the sounds of the kitchen, the sounds of the street outside, and felt, surrounded by incomprehensibility, strangely at peace. Language was most of what he was made of. Traveling without it was strange and limiting and uncomfortable. It was also intermittently a kind of liberation. You were simply here. You could not perform yourself with words. You were just a person in a place, receiving it. On the last day, he went back to the ramen shop. The same woman. He ordered the same bowl by the same method, pointing, one finger. When she brought it, he looked up and said, carefully, "Arigatou gozaimasu." Thank you very much. Her face opened into a real smile. She said something he didn't understand and went back behind the counter. He ate his ramen. It was again extraordinary. He thought, words matter, and also sometimes the gap between languages is where something else gets through. Story 11. Returning. The flight home landed at 7:30 in the morning. Outside the small oval window, the familiar shapes of the city appeared through gray cloud. The river, the bridges, the cluster of towers in the center, the spreading residential grid of streets and parks that fanned out in every direction. Elena had been away for 6 weeks. She had traveled through 4 countries, slept in 11 different beds, and eaten things she loved and things she did not, and one thing she could not identify, but which she ate all of anyway. She had been cold and hot and rained on and sunburned, sometimes in the same day. She had been lost in good ways and bad ways. She had been lonely, briefly, on 2 occasions, and had made 2 friends she intended to keep. She pressed her face to the window as the plane descended. There was the park where she ran on weekend mornings. There was the hospital where she worked, a cluster of low buildings she could identify from above. There, on the eastern edge of the city, barely visible in the gray light, was the area where she lived, the streets familiar even at this angle. She had not expected to feel so glad. She had left 6 weeks ago in a mood of restlessness, wanting to be somewhere else, wanting to be in motion, wanting the particular sensation of the first day in an unfamiliar place. She had had all of this, and it had been good, and here she was at the end of it, looking down at the place she had left and feeling, what? Relief, recognition, the exact opposite of restlessness. The plane touched down with a soft thump. People began immediately to retrieve bags from overhead lockers, despite the pilot's request that they remain seated. Elena remained seated. She was in no hurry. The city was not going anywhere. It had been here throughout her absence, doing what it did, and it would continue after she walked out of the terminal into the cold morning air. She collected her bag. She went through passport control. She stepped out of the arrivals hall into the gray morning. The air smelled of the city. It smelled of nothing particular, of traffic and damp concrete and something faintly green from the park nearby, which was to say it smelled exactly like itself, exactly like home. She stood on the pavement for a moment, bag at her feet. She had come back. This was the other half of travel, always. The return, which was its own kind of arrival. You came back to the place you had left, and it was the same place, and you were not quite the same person, and that slight difference between the two was the thing the journey had given you. She picked up her bag and walked to the bus stop. Story 12. The Map. Dara had been collecting maps for 20 years. Not digital maps, paper maps. Ordnance survey sheets, tourist maps, city plans, nautical charts, topographical surveys, hand-drawn sketch maps she had been given by locals in various parts of the world who had drawn on scraps of paper or cardboard or, once, the back of a receipt, to show her how to get somewhere. She kept them in large flat drawers in the studio she used for her illustration work, organized loosely by geography. The British Isles in one drawer, Europe in another, the rest of the world in a third, miscellaneous in a fourth. She could find most of them, but not all, and occasionally something surfaced that she had forgotten she had, and she spent 20 minutes looking at it. She took a map with her everywhere she traveled. This was partly practical. She was one of those people who maintained a genuine preference for paper over screen when navigating, and partly something less rational. A map of a place, she had come to believe, was a relationship with that place. It was a promise. I will go here. I will pay enough attention to need to know where I am. The map she had of the Portuguese coast was annotated in pencil, small marks where she had stopped, notes about things she had seen, a question mark at a bay she had never reached and still meant to. The map of Kyoto had a coffee ring on the top right corner from a cafe near the station where she had sat for an hour on the second day working out a route. The map of the Scottish Highlands had been folded and refolded so many times that it was soft as fabric at the creases. These were not souvenirs, exactly. They were records, not of what she had bought or photographed, but of where she had been and how she had moved through places, the decisions made at crossroads, the paths chosen and not chosen, the scale of distances she had covered on foot versus the vast distances that remained uncrossed. She had a large map of the world, a good one, accurate projection, physical geography marked in the rich colors of altitude and depth, pinned to the wall above her desk. She had marked on it, with small dots, the places she had been. The dots were numerous in some areas and entirely absent in others. There was a great deal of white space. She looked at this map often, not with dissatisfaction at the white spaces. She was not that kind of traveler, the kind who counted countries as achievements. She looked at it with the feeling of possibility. The white spaces were not failures, they were futures. She did not know which of them she would reach. She did not know how much time she had for the reaching. She knew only that somewhere in the white space was the next place she would go, which she did not yet know, but which the map was already holding, patient and ready, waiting for her to arrive. Story 13. The Border. The border crossing took 4 hours. This was not unusual, the driver explained, in the unhurried manner of someone who had made this journey many times. The queue moved in increments, a few meters forward, then a stop, then a few more. Outside the windows, the landscape was flat and pale, scattered with dry scrub and the occasional distant tree standing alone in all that emptiness. Marcus had been traveling for 11 days. He had taken 3 buses, 2 trains, and 1 taxi that turned out not to be a taxi but simply a man with a car who needed to go in the same direction. He was on his way to a city he had chosen mainly because a friend of a friend had described it once as the most beautiful place I have ever been to, and the most inconvenient to reach. Both halves of this description appeared to be accurate. At the border, he stepped off the bus with the other passengers. They queued in a concrete building with a corrugated metal roof and a single ceiling fan that rotated slowly without appearing to move any air. A guard behind a window examined his passport with the concentrated attention of someone reading something complicated. He asked Marcus 3 questions. Marcus answered them. The guard stamped the passport and slid it back. Outside, he bought water from a small stand operated by a woman who appeared to be about 80 and who gave him a plastic cup of something cold and sweet alongside the bottle without being asked. He drank it standing in the thin shade of the building's roof overhang. Around him, other passengers rested, waited, made phone calls. A child ran between the adult's legs, apparently entirely unbothered by the heat or the delay. They reboarded the bus. The crossing resumed. At some point, without announcement or ceremony, they were in a different country. The same landscape on either side, the same flat, pale distances, but a different name on the signs, a different flag above the checkpoint they had now passed. He looked out the window and tried to feel the difference. He was not sure he could. Countries were, in the end, lines drawn on maps, real lines, with real consequences, but invisible to the land itself. The bus moved on. The sun moved across the sky. The city was still hours ahead. He had time. He had always had time for this kind of thing, and he had learned to understand this not as a privilege of leisure, but as a choice, to make space for the slow, awkward, inconvenient business of going somewhere properly rather than just arriving. He leaned his head against the window. The scrub rolled past. He was, in this moment, entirely in transit, between countries, between one version of the journey and the next. It was, he thought, one of his favorite places to be. Story 14. The Village in the Mountains. The village had no name on any map she owned. Petra had been hiking for 3 days in the high mountains of a range she had planned carefully, but which had, as mountains often do, quietly deviated from those plans. On the second day, she had taken a path that seemed correct, and then less correct, and then clearly incorrect, and had spent the better part of the afternoon finding her way back to something marked. On the third afternoon, descending a long slope of loose shale toward a valley she could see below but not yet reach, she had seen the village, a cluster of stone houses with dark red roofs, a thin line of smoke from one chimney, a road that wound into the valley from the far end and stopped there, going nowhere else. She descended. The village, when she reached it, was small, perhaps 15 or 20 houses, a fountain in a central square, a building that might have been a church and might have been something else. An old man sat on a bench outside one of the houses. He watched her approach without apparent surprise. She greeted him in the language of the country, which she spoke only partially. He responded in a dialect she didn't recognize at all. They regarded each other with mutual incomprehension and mutual goodwill, which is one of the older forms of human communication and more effective than it sounds. A younger woman appeared from inside the house. She spoke some words of a shared language, not English but a third language that both of them had half, and between two halves they managed to construct a rough hole. There was a room, the woman said. She could stay if she needed. There was food later if she wanted it. She needed and wanted both. The room was simple and clean. The food was a stew of vegetables and something she couldn't identify but which was good. She sat at a table with the woman's family, 4 or 5 people across several generations, and they ate together and she answered questions and asked them in the vocabulary they shared, which was small but sufficient. After dinner, The old man who had been on the bench brought out a bottle of something clear, and they had a small glass each. He said something, raising his glass. The woman translated as best she could, something about the mountains and travelers and welcome. She walked the village in the dark before sleeping. The stars overhead were extraordinary. The air was too thin and the village too remote for any meaningful light pollution, and the sky was entirely given over to them. She stood in the square looking up for a long time. She did not know the name of this place. She never found it on a map, though she looked later. It existed, as some of the best places do, slightly outside the record of things. Story 15. The Slow Train South. The journey from the northern city to the coastal town was supposed to take 3 hours by express. Finn had instead taken the local service, which stopped at every station along the way. 31 stations, the timetable informed him, over 6 hours and 40 minutes. He had done this deliberately. He was in no hurry. The train was old and unhurried to match. Wooden seats worn smooth, windows that could actually be opened, a buffet car that sold coffee in small paper cups, and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. It was the kind of train that felt like it had been making this same journey for decades, and saw no reason to change. He sat by the window and watched the country go by. It changed slowly and then noticeably as they moved south. The gray industrial outskirts of the northern city giving way to farmland, then to low hills, then to the broader and flatter landscapes of the south, the light becoming whiter and softer as they descended toward the coast. At each station, people got on and off. At some, the train stopped for only a minute. At others, it idled for 5 or 10 minutes, for reasons that were never explained and that seemed, after a while, not to require explanation. Time was being spent differently here. He fell into conversation with a woman in the opposite seat who was traveling to visit her daughter. She was carrying a large bag of things for the daughter. Food, she explained, home things. She was the kind of person who visited with bags. They talked for the better part of an hour in a mixture of her limited English and his limited local words, and a fair amount of gesture and expression. He learned about her daughter's new apartment and her daughter's job, and the town where the daughter lived, which was apparently beautiful but also cold in winter, which the woman regarded as a personal failing of the town. At the station before the one where the woman got off, she opened the large bag and produced a small wrapped package and gave it to him. He protested. She insisted. He accepted. The package contained 2 biscuits and a small jar of something preserved, which he could not read the label of. He ate the biscuits before the train reached the coast. They were very good, sweet and dense and spiced with something he couldn't name. The coastline appeared in the early afternoon. Suddenly, a turn around a cliff, and there it was, the sea, flat and very blue. The town spread along its edge in white and terracotta. He felt the same thing he always felt at first sight of the sea after time inland, a loosening, a relief, as if the body remembered something the mind had almost forgotten. He ate the preserved thing from the jar that evening with bread he bought from a bakery near the port. It was quince paste, or something close to it. It was very good. Story 16. The Long Walk Home. She walked home from the airport. This sounds more dramatic than it was. The airport was not far from the edge of the city, and the edge of the city was, for her, home. The walk took 4 hours and 20 minutes. She had done it before, twice, after previous trips, and she always timed her return flights to arrive in the early morning so that she could walk back through the city as it woke. Lucia had been away for 3 weeks, traveling in a part of the world where the time zone was far enough removed from home that she had never quite synchronized. She arrived at dawn feeling neither tired nor fully awake, in the in-between state that long-distance travel produces, where the body is present but slightly unmoored. She collected her bag. She declined the taxi queue. She walked out of the terminal into the cool early air and turned toward the city. The route she had worked out passed through an industrial zone first, then through a grid of streets she found interesting precisely because they were not picturesque, loading bays and wholesalers and the backs of warehouses, the working infrastructure of a city which most people only saw by accident. Then through a residential neighborhood that was just beginning to stir, lights coming on behind curtains, the smell of bread, a dog being walked by a person who looked as unmoored as she felt. Then into the older parts of the city, the parts she knew best, where the streets narrowed and the buildings pressed closer and the pavements were uneven in ways that had never been corrected because they were part of the character of the place. Past the market, which was setting up, stalls being unpacked, boxes of fruit arranged, the particular shouted negotiations of early morning commerce. She stopped for coffee at a place she had been stopping at for 15 years. The man behind the bar knew her face, if not her name, and greeted her with the nod reserved for regulars. She drank the coffee standing at the bar as she always did, bag at her feet. The last section of the walk was uphill. The neighborhood where she lived sat on a slight elevation above the center, and the approach to it climbed gradually through a series of streets she knew so well she could have walked them in the dark, and sometimes had. She opened her front door. The apartment was exactly as she had left it. The light inside was the morning light, slightly blue, coming through the east-facing windows. She stood in the entrance for a moment without putting anything down. Arriving home after travel was always like this, the place itself unchanged, and yourself subtly not the same, and the small gap between those two things, something you inhabited for a day or two before they reconciled. She was glad to be here. She had been glad to leave. Both things were true. They always were. Story 17. The Guest House by the Sea. The guest house did not appear on any booking website. She had found it written in pencil, on a piece of paper, in a notebook she kept for recommendations, the name of the town, a street, and the words, "Ask for the Blue Door." Nadia had been given this information 3 years ago by a woman she had met on a ferry and had not seen since. The woman had said, "If you are ever in that part of the coast in October, go there." She had said it with the conviction of someone describing something important. Nadia was, in October, in that part of the coast. She went. The Blue Door was not hard to find. It was in fact the only blue door on the street, a narrow street that ran parallel to the water and smelled of salt and something faintly floral she couldn't identify. She knocked. An older man opened the door. She explained that she was looking for a room and that someone had told her to come here. He considered this. He let her in. The guest house had 4 rooms. 3 of them were occupied by what appeared to be the same 3 people. A couple who were writing something. They sat at a table covered in papers every morning and evening, and a man who painted, whose canvases dried on the balcony in various states of blue. The 4th room was hers. She stayed for 9 nights. This had been her intention for 3, but the town and the guest house, and October at that latitude, the particular softness of the light, the warmth still in the afternoons but the cool at the edges of morning and evening, made leaving feel premature for much longer than she had planned. The man who ran the guest house was named Orestes. He cooked a small breakfast each morning, bread and cheese and fruit, and sometimes an egg, and left it on a table in the entrance hall at 7, which was when he got up, and which was therefore when everyone else got up, as the smell of the bread and the sound of him moving around made sleeping later feel unnecessary. He did not ask questions, and he did not offer much conversation, but he was present in the way that good hosts are present, available without hovering, helpful without expectation. The house was his, and he shared it, and that was a form of generosity she found herself thinking about afterward. On her last morning, she asked him about the woman who had sent her, describing her as best she could. He considered the description. He nodded once. "She comes every 2 or 3 years," he said. "She has been coming for a long time." Nadia thought about this on the bus out of the town. She had been recommended to a place by someone who herself returned. She might return too. The guest house would be there. The blue door, the small breakfast, the canvases drying in the October light. She wrote the address in her notebook, not in pencil, in ink. Story 18, The Language of Signs. In 6 days of travel in a country whose language he did not speak at all, James had developed a working understanding of its signs. Not a reading knowledge, he could not decode the alphabet, which was different from any he knew, but a visual understanding, the shape of words for pharmacy, for exit, for danger, for bread, the color coding of transport maps, the universal sign language of pointing, nodding, holding up fingers for numbers. He had also developed a respect for the people who patiently navigated his non-comprehension. The woman at the train station who, when he showed her his ticket and a confused expression, simply walked him to the correct platform without a word, and pointed at the board, and then at the train, and then gave him a look that said clearly, "There." He had thanked her. She had nodded, as if it were nothing, which perhaps it was, but to him it was not nothing. The man at the bakery who held up each item and said its name clearly and waited for him to repeat it, not in a mocking way, in the way of someone who thought this was simply the natural order of things. You say the name, the visitor learns, the transaction is also a lesson. By the 4th day, he could order bread correctly and without hesitation. The child on the bus, perhaps 7 or 8, who had studied him openly for 20 minutes and then asked him something in the local language. He had spread his hands. She had thought for a moment and then asked, in fractured English, "Where are you from?" He had told her. She had nodded gravely and reported this back to the woman next to her, who was presumably her grandmother, who had looked at him and said something that the child translated as, "She says it is a long way." It was a long way. He had come a long way. Travel in countries with unfamiliar languages had this effect. It made him a child again, linguistically speaking. He could not express complexity. He could not make jokes. He could not negotiate or argue or explain himself in more than the most basic terms. This was humbling, and when he stopped resisting it, oddly freeing. He was stripped back to what could be communicated without words. He flew home with a notebook full of words he had written down phonetically. The words for thank you and please and good and how much and I don't understand and which direction, and a deep and personal affection for a country whose language he still could not read. He would learn some of it before the next visit. He had already decided there would be a next visit. He had already decided many things about the next visit, while standing at the departure's gate. Story 19. What the Sea Teaches. She had lived near the sea her whole life, but had never paid it the kind of attention she paid it on this particular trip. Imogen was 53. She had rented a small house on a headland for 2 weeks in late September, alone, something she had wanted to do for years and had arranged and rearranged around other obligations until this year, when she had simply put it in the calendar and refused to move it. The house faced west. The sea was visible from every front window and from the garden, where she sat each evening to watch the sunset. The garden was small and exposed. The wind came directly off the water and moved through it without obstruction, and she took a blanket out each evening and sat wrapped in it on a low stone wall and watched the light on the water until there was no light. She walked on the beach every morning. It was a shingle beach, which she found harder going than sand. The stones shifted with each step, so you had to work slightly harder and pay more attention. She had started wearing better shoes. She had started noticing her feet. She had not intended this trip to be anything in particular. Not a retreat, not a therapy, not a turning point. Just time, near water, alone. What the sea seemed to be teaching her, in the 2 weeks she paid attention, was something about scale and rhythm. The tide went out and came back. The waves came in. The horizon was always the same distance away. The scale of it, the visible portion of the sea, set against the visible portion of the sky, both enormous, made the scale of the things she usually worried about feel different. Not small, exactly, but proportionate. She was not the kind of person who drew grand conclusions from travel. She distrusted the idea that a fortnight somewhere beautiful would resolve something that years of daily life had not. But she noticed, over the 2 weeks, a change in the quality of her thinking. A less pressured quality, more space between thoughts. On the last day, she sat on the seawall for a long time after the sun had gone down, until the sky was dark and the sea was a sound rather than a sight. She was not ready to leave and also ready to leave, both things. She packed methodically the following morning. She took 1 stone from the beach, just one, which she had decided in advance was acceptable, a smooth oval of gray granite that fit exactly in the palm of her hand. She still has it. She knows where it is at all times. Story 20. The Mountain Before Dawn. The alarm went off at 3 in the morning. For a moment, in the absolute dark of the room, he did not know where he was. Then the mountain, the refuge, tomorrow's summit, he remembered. He dressed in the dark, by feel, layers, because the mountain would be cold before sunrise. Boots that he had packed carefully, knowing they would matter. He ate a small breakfast in the refuge's kitchen, bread and something warm from a pot left on a low flame, alongside 3 other people who had the same idea for the same morning and who moved with the same quiet and purposeful economy. They set off at 3:45. The sky was extraordinary, no moon, and this high and far from any city the stars were vivid to the point of being startling. He had not seen stars like this since the last time he had been on a mountain before dawn, which was also the only other time he had been on a mountain before dawn. The path was marked with reflective paint on the rocks, which his headlamp caught every few meters. He followed them in a kind of trance, the world reduced to the small circle of light around his feet, the darkness beyond it complete. The other 3 walkers spread out behind and ahead of him, their headlamps visible as bobbing points of yellow light. After 2 hours of climbing, the sky began to change at the edges. Not light yet, something before light, a slight reduction in the quality of the dark. The horizon became distinguishable from the sky, faintly. He stopped for a moment to look at this. The summit took another 40 minutes. He arrived in a group of 6 people he had never met, all of them arriving at roughly the same time by different paths. A man alone, a pair of women in their 60s, a young couple who held hands on the last section of ridge. No one spoke much. They all looked east. The sun came over the horizon and the mountains lit up in an order. The highest peaks first, catching the light before the lower ones, turning pink and then amber and then gold as the sky behind them went from black to deep blue to pale blue to something approaching the ordinary blue of a clear morning. It took about 15 minutes from the first light to the ordinary morning. He would remember this for a long time, not the difficulty or the early alarm or the cold or the miles covered. He would remember the 15 minutes in which the world turned from dark to light, the mountains receiving it in order of their height. He would remember standing there with 5 strangers, all of them watching the same thing, none of them saying a word. Story 21. The Bicycle. He rented the bicycle on the first day and returned it, after much deliberation, on the last. Tom had not planned to spend his entire week in the small coastal town cycling. He had planned to walk, mostly, and take a boat trip, and perhaps rent a car for a day to explore further inland. But the bicycle changed things. It was a simple machine, 3 gears, a basket on the front, a bell he used more than was strictly necessary. He rented it from a shop near the harbor run by a teenage boy who explained the gears with the long-suffering air of someone who had given this explanation many times and knew it wasn't always absorbed. The first day he cycled to the market town 8 kilometers north. The road ran along the coast for most of it, the sea visible on his left, a low stone wall separating him from a drop to the water. The cycling was easy, mostly flat, a gentle headwind going, but a tailwind coming back. He stopped 3 times. Once to look at a heron standing motionless in a cove below, once to read a roadside information board about a ship that had sunk offshore in 1847, once simply because the view around a particular bend was good enough to require stopping. Over the week, he discovered the area differently than he would have on foot or by car. The bicycle moved at a speed that was neither too fast to notice nor too slow to cover distance. He found a village he had not known was there, following a lane that curved away from the main road on a whim. He found a beach accessible only by a muddy track too rough for a car, but manageable on 2 wheels. He found a cafe at the top of a long climb he had decided to attempt out of stubbornness that served the best coffee he had that week. On the last evening, he cycled out to a point he had saved, a small headland at the southern tip of the peninsula, which he had read had a good view at sunset. He arrived 20 minutes before and sat on the grass at the point with the bicycle beside him and watched the sun go into the water. On the way back, in the dark, he had a light, but it was modest. He passed nobody. The lane was completely his. The sound of the bicycle was the only sound. He felt, briefly and completely, the particular freedom that comes from moving under your own power through a dark world, knowing where you're going, capable of getting there. He returned the bicycle the following morning with some reluctance. The boy behind the counter did not notice the reluctance. He noted the condition of the bicycle. He refunded the deposit. He said, "Good riding?" "Yes," Tom said. "Good riding." Story 22. The River City. She arrived by river. This was not the conventional way to arrive. Most people came by road or rail. But there was a ferry service along the river, slow, used mainly by locals, and she had taken it from the smaller town upstream, sitting on the open deck for 3 hours as the river widened and the banks changed from farmland to the first outer streets of the city, and then to the old stone buildings of the center, which reached right to the river's edge in places. their reflections rippling in the brown water. Arriving this way, from the water, looking in, gave her a different view of the city than she would have had from a train or a bus. She could see the logic of the place from here, the bridge network spanning the river, the towers and spires that marked the old center, the arc of the embankment road with its old lamps. She could see where the city had grown around the water because of the water. Water had been why this city was here at all. Her hostel was 2 streets from the main embankment, in a building that had once been a warehouse and still had the wide wooden beams and high ceilings of a building designed to hold cargo. It was clean and well run and full of other people who were also moving through places. She spent 4 days. She walked the embankment every day. She walked the old market, which sold everything and was overwhelming in the best way. She sat in a particular square she had found by accident on the second afternoon, which had a fountain and 2 benches and a cafe that kept its chairs outside even in the mild autumn cold. She sat there for 2 hours on the 3rd day reading, and again on the 4th, and the woman who ran the cafe seemed to recognize her on the 4th day with a nod. She took the ferry back upstream on the 5th morning. The river moved differently in this direction, slower somehow, though that was the physics of it working against them. The farmland reappeared on the banks. The city receded. She watched it go. The towers, the bridges, the old buildings that had reached right to the water's edge, as if toward her. She had arrived as a stranger and left as something not quite a stranger. That was, she thought, about as much as 4 days could honestly give. Story 23. The Pilgrim Road. She had not set out to walk a pilgrimage route. She had simply needed to walk, and the route had been there. Elena had been going through a period she would later describe, carefully, as difficult. Not a crisis, not a collapse, but the slower, less dramatic experience of a life that had drifted from its own shape. She had taken 2 weeks off work and driven to the start of the path more or less on impulse, with boots she had owned for years but barely used, and a backpack she had repacked 3 times the night before. The route was old. People had been walking it for centuries, for reasons spiritual and physical and practical. On the first morning, setting out before 6 to avoid the heat of the later hours, she fell into step behind 2 women who were talking quietly in a language she didn't know, and ahead of a man who walked with 2 poles and the focused rhythm of someone who had walked many miles before and expected to walk many more. She did not speak to them, she walked. By the end of the first day, she had covered 22 kilometers and understood several things. That her boots were good but her socks were wrong, that she had overpacked by approximately half, and that walking all day was something entirely different from walking for an hour or 2. By the end of the 3rd day, she had understood something else, which was harder to articulate. The walking itself, the physical fact of it, 1 foot then the other, hour after hour, did something to the quality of her thoughts. The pressure she had been carrying, the background noise of the life she had stepped back from, did not disappear, but it changed. It became lighter, more manageable, as if the rhythmic motion of the body had given the mind permission to loosen its grip. She met people along the way. Some she talked to, most she simply nodded at, and this too felt right. The shared acknowledgement of people engaged in the same simple act for reasons that were each their own and did not need explaining. She arrived at the end of the route on the 9th day. She sat down on a low wall outside the town and took off her boots and looked at them. They had done good work. She had done good work. She did not feel transformed. She felt tired and clean and quieter than she had been. This was enough. This was, she thought, the point, not transformation, but the smaller thing, the restoration of something to its proper proportion. She drove home 2 days later. The life she had left was still there. She had changed her relationship to it, slightly but meaningfully, by walking away from it for 9 days at 3 miles an hour. Story 24. The Photograph. He had been to this city once before, 20 years ago, and he had a photograph to prove it. The photograph showed a younger version of himself standing in front of a fountain in a square. He was smiling. He was wearing a jacket he no longer owned. Behind him was the fountain, and behind the fountain was a row of buildings with tall windows and elaborate facades. He did not remember much else about the visit, except that the fountain had been very beautiful, and the jacket had been a gift from someone he no longer spoke to. Now he was back. He was 51. The jacket was long gone. The fountain was still there. He found it on the second afternoon, partly by memory and partly by accident. The square was smaller than he remembered, or perhaps he was simply larger, in the way of people returning to places from their past. The fountain was exactly as photographed. The same stone figures, the same arrangement of water falling from tier to tier, the same light catching it in the afternoon. He stood in front of it and took out his phone and looked at the photograph and then at the fountain. They matched. He thought about the person who had taken the original photograph. She had held a camera and said something, he couldn't remember what, and he had smiled, and the shutter had clicked. Where was she now? He didn't know. He hadn't known for 15 years. He took a new photograph, himself, with the fountain behind him. He was alone this time, so he held the phone at arm's length and got the angle slightly wrong, and the fountain was mostly obscured by his shoulder, which seemed right somehow, the past and the present overlapping imperfectly. He sat at a cafe in the square for an hour afterward and drank a coffee and looked at the fountain. He was aware of performing some kind of accounting, the 20 years, what they had contained, what he had done with them, what he had not. But he did not pursue the accounting all the way to any conclusion. He let it stay open. The fountain played on. The afternoon light moved. He was 51 and he was 21, and he was in a square that had existed long before either of those ages and would exist long after. He left the square feeling, for no particular reason he could name, lighter. Story 25. The Wrong Season. She had come to see the cherry blossoms. She had arrived, due to a miscalculation of 2 weeks, after they had already fallen. This was mortifying and then funny, and then, as she walked through the park full of the green aftermath of the blossoms, the fresh leaves, the emptied branches, the small petal remnants still visible in the corners and gutters, actually fine, more than fine. She had thought she was coming to a city in its most famous moment. She had arrived instead in an ordinary one. The crowds that came for the blossoms were gone. The parks were inhabited by people who lived nearby, walking dogs and jogging and eating lunch on benches, performing the ordinary daily acts of city life in a setting that, without the famous flowers, revealed itself as simply very pleasant. She walked through those parks for 3 of her 5 days. She walked the neighborhood streets without consulting her phone much. She found a noodle shop that appeared to have no specific reputation, except that it was full of people who worked nearby, which was the best kind of reputation. She found a bookshop that sold only old maps, which delighted her for reasons she didn't fully understand. She visited 2 temples. They were beautiful. They were also, in the off-peak season, quiet, which she had read was difficult to achieve in this city at almost any time of year. She sat in the garden of one of them for 40 minutes on the third morning and counted 11 other visitors, total. On the last evening, she looked up when the cherry blossoms would actually be at their peak and calculated that she would need to come back approximately this time next year, adjusted by 2 weeks. This seemed reasonable. She began to plan it while eating the best dumplings she had ever had, at a place she had found by following the smell down a narrow street. Missing the thing she had come for had shown her everything she would have walked past on the way to it. Story 26. The Overnight Bus. The overnight bus left the capital at 11:15 and arrived by a miracle of scheduling at 6:40 the next morning. This gave you, depending on how well you slept on a bus, somewhere between 4 and 6 hours of actual sleep and a saving of one night's accommodation. Yusuf had taken many overnight buses. He was not sentimental about them. They were a tool for covering distance cheaply, with the side effect of occasionally very good conversations with strangers in the small hours of the morning. This particular bus was full. He had a window seat, which he preferred because the glass was cold and he could press his forehead against it when he couldn't sleep, and looking at the dark landscape going past was better than looking at the ceiling. Beside him was a young woman with a large backpack stored under the seat and a neck pillow already in place, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times. She fell asleep before the city had fully receded. He stayed awake for the first 3 hours, looking out at the dark countryside, the occasional lights of a farmhouse or a village, the headlamps of trucks coming the other way. He thought about nothing in particular. This was one of the things he had found about being in motion. It was easier to think about nothing. The movement seemed to absorb the energy that would otherwise become thoughts. He slept eventually, fitfully, waking at each stop. At the largest stop, a terminal where the bus waited for 20 minutes, he got off and drank a coffee from a machine that produced something hot and approximately coffee-like. The woman with the neck pillow appeared beside him and did the same. They did not speak. They drank their approximate coffees and got back on. He arrived at 6:40 as promised. The city he had come to was pale and quiet in the early morning, the streets not yet fully awake. He collected his bag and walked out into it. He was tired in the particular clean way that followed overnight travel, wrung out but alert, as if his senses had been reset. The city was new. The morning was very light. He had nowhere to be for an hour. He found a bench near a fountain and sat on it and watched the city open its eyes. Story 27. The Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage. The cottage had been a lighthouse keeper's residence for over 100 years before the lighthouse was automated and the keeper's position made redundant. The organization that now managed the lighthouse had converted the cottage into a self-catering rental, which was how she came to spend 5 nights in it alone in November. She had chosen November deliberately. The summer visitors who rented coastal cottages wanted warmth and light. She wanted neither particularly, or rather, she wanted them in moderation, the way November provided them, which was sparingly and therefore meaningfully. The cottage was small and thick-walled and looked out from its headland across a bay that was, in November, various shades of gray and green, and occasionally, when the light shifted in the late afternoon, a sudden and startling blue. The lighthouse itself stood adjacent, white and silent, its automated beam turning through its cycle each night without needing her or anyone else. She walked every day. The headland had several paths maintained by volunteers, and she walked all of them over the 5 days, some of them more than once. The weather was variable: bright cold mornings, afternoon clouds, one day of steady rain that she walked in anyway. She had good waterproofs. She had been told to bring good waterproofs. She read in the evenings. She cooked simple meals from the shop in the village 4 kilometers down the road, where she drove every second day. The woman at the shop commented, on the second visit, that she must be staying at the lighthouse cottage. And when she confirmed this, the woman said, "It's lovely up there in winter. You have it to yourselves." The yourselves, she noted, was singular in this context. She and the lighthouse, perhaps, or she and the headland, or she and the gray-green bay. On the 4th night, the sea was rough enough that she could hear it from the bedroom, a low, constant roar that was nothing like the wind but was related to it, the sea responding to the weather of the previous days with its characteristic slight delay. She lay and listened to it. The lighthouse beam swept through the curtains at its regular interval. She found it, unexpectedly, a deeply companionable sound. The sea doing its work, the lighthouse doing its work, the cottage standing against the wind as it had always stood. She was a temporary occupant. The headland had held other people and would hold more. She was one page of a very long record. She slept, finally, to the sound of the sea. In the morning the bay was silver and still, and the lighthouse stood white against a pale sky, and she stood at the window for a long time before making coffee. Their outro. And there our journeys end for tonight. You have traveled on an overnight train through a sleeping country, crossed to a small island by ferry, walked lost through the cobbled streets of Lisbon, driven a coastal road with a brother while grieving a father. You have climbed to a mountain hut above the clouds, drifted down a slow river with a patient mother, taken the wrong train to somewhere unexpected. You have walked a cliff path, fallen for an unplanned city, ordered ramen in a language you didn't speak, returned home with new eyes, and spent time with someone who collects maps not as souvenirs but as promises. You have waited at borders and found villages without names, ridden slow trains and rented bicycles, watched the sunrise from a mountain summit, arrived at cities by river. You have walked pilgrim roads, returned to old photographs, arrived in the wrong season and found something better, and ridden overnight buses toward pale morning cities. All of this, in English, all of it yours. Travel teaches us, among other things, that we can do more than we thought, navigate more, understand more, endure more, feel more. So does learning a language. Both of them require stepping out of the familiar into something new and trusting that you will find your way. You are finding your way. Keep going. Please subscribe to Cozy English if these stories have helped you. Share this video with someone who is learning. And wherever you are tonight, rest well. Good night.